In 1962, an architect named Bernie Tucker was hired to study a post office building before converting it into a library. The Treasury Department's approved drawings labeled the ceiling above the sorting room as a ventilation gallery. So why did that ventilation system have its own private entrance on the east side of the building, one that bypassed every space employees could see? And why had the postmaster never been told when it was serviced, or by whom? Tucker opened the ceiling and found out. The drawing said ventilation, louvered grills, ornamental plaster surround. Tucker found none of that. He found a network of human-sized catwalks running the full length of the building, a separate external stairwell, invisible from inside. That delivered a person directly above the sorting floor without passing through any space employees could see. Viewing slits cut into the plaster with precision above every surface where workers handled mail. And breakout doors, interior access points for immediate entry to the floor below if a worker was observed destroying evidence and there was no time to go around. The workers who stood beneath that ceiling for 50 years had no idea it was occupied. The building had been designed that way before the first stone was laid, and the system was still legally operational the day Tucker walked in. That last fact is the one that doesn't resolve easily. The blueprint said, ventilation. The building contained a surveillance apparatus. The system was in active use for half a century. And the design was not unique to Murfreesboro. It was a standard plan, reproduced across hundreds of locations, produced by the same federal office that approved every post office in the country. This is not the story of one building. It is the story of what that building was designed to be, and what the blueprint was written to conceal. If you enjoy these stories, then support the channel by liking and subscribing. Thank you. The New Deal Post Office is one of the most recognizable civic structures in American life. Between the 1890s and 1939, the Office of the Supervising Architect of the Treasury Department controlled the design and construction of every federal post office in the country. What emerged was a coherent architectural statement: limestone columns, classical proportions, ornamental plaster ceilings, to WPA murals on the lobby walls. These were not just functional buildings. They were meant to represent the permanence and dignity of democratic government, a public institution that belonged to everyone, open to every citizen, built to last. The ornamented ceilings were a signature feature: plaster friezes, coffered panels, louvered grills set into decorative surrounds. In the grandest examples, like the James A. Farley Building in New York, the painted plaster ceilings of the reception halls were divided into sections 30 feet wide, each decorated with carved national emblems. These ceilings told you something about the institution. They were meant to. The Postal Inspection Service had existed since 1772, when Benjamin Franklin appointed the first postal surveyor to regulate and audit the mail system. In 1792, Congress made mail theft a capital crime. By the time the New Deal building program was underway in the 1930s, the Inspection Service employed more than 600 agents operating across the country. They called themselves the Silent Service. The name was not metaphorical. It is worth sitting with those two facts together before continuing. The Treasury Department was building civic monuments with decorated ceilings. The oldest federal law enforcement agency in the country was called the Silent Service. The blueprints were the same blueprints. The Murfreesboro building is the clearest documented case, because Tucker's discovery in 1962 was specific enough to survive in the historical record. The external inspector's entrance was on the east side of the building. It is now bricked over. Through that entrance, an inspector could climb a narrow winding stairwell, access the catwalk system above the ceiling, and move through the entire building without passing through any space visible to the workers below. Former postmaster Norman Hutchinson, who took the job shortly after the building was vacated, described what the system meant in practice. He only knew the inspectors had been present when the custodian found signs of their visit afterward. The inspector's maintenance domain was serviced only on days specified by Hutchinson's superiors. He was not told when they would come. He was not told what they had seen. The viewing stations covered every area where employees worked or gathered, every sorting table, every distribution point, and one other location that Hutchinson mentioned without elaboration. At some point in the late 1960s or early 1970s, he was informed that the viewing station into the women's restroom had been closed. There had been no complaints at the Murfreesboro location specifically. There may have been complaints elsewhere. That is the complete record on that point. It ends there. The first question is whether Murfreesboro is an outlier. The second question answers the first. The 1910 Federal Post Office in Santa Rosa, California, was designed by James Knox Taylor, who served as supervising architect of the Treasury Department from 1897 to 1912. Taylor was responsible for hundreds of federal buildings. The Santa Rosa building is a Roman Renaissance revival structure with limestone columns and Spanish terracotta roofing, built from plans produced in Washington and applied locally, as all these buildings were. At the top of its interior staircase is a door that opens onto a boardwalk. From that boardwalk, a series of shafts and ladders give access to secret viewing corridors in the attic. The system allowed the postmaster or postal inspector to observe all operations on the floor below without being seen. Two buildings, different cities, different supervising architects, different decades of construction, the same infrastructure. The old post office building in Washington, D.C. The federal institution's own headquarters building had catwalks spanning the atrium at the third floor level, positioned to allow supervisors to look directly down on workers handling mail. This was not a hidden feature. It was visible from the atrium floor. The catwalk was there in plain sight because the workers looking up at it had no way to know when it was occupied. What you can see and what is watching you are not the same question. Think about what the sorting room actually looked like in 1934. Not the lobby. The lobby was the civic monument, the marble floors, the murals of farmers and steelworkers commissioned by the section of fine arts, the vaulted ceiling catching the afternoon light through tall windows. The sorting room was behind the counter and through a door the public never used. Long tables under fluorescent light, canvas mail sacks along the walls, workers standing for 8-hour shifts, moving through hundreds of pieces per hour, pulling letters and packages by destination, by route, by the weight of them in the hand. In the Depression years, you could feel the difference between a card and an envelope with something folded inside it. The paper gave slightly under your thumb. The contents shifted when you tilted it. Every worker on that floor knew the feeling. Every inspector above it knew they knew. A sorter on federal wages in 1934 earned roughly $25 a week. That was stable income in a collapsing economy. Real money, money that kept a family housed. The inspectors above were not watching for career criminals. They were watching for the moment when a man or woman with a sick child and 2 weeks of back rent decided that an envelope with $4 inside it was worth the risk. The Depression did not create thieves. It created conditions under which a person who had never stolen anything might spend 6 months reasoning themselves toward it, worry a little closer each week, watching the envelopes move through their hands. The system above the ceiling was built for that person. The plaster ornament that concealed the slit was designed to give them no way to know the calculation had already been made on their behalf. I've read descriptions of these buildings for months. The pattern is not subtle once you know what you're looking at. The ornamental ceilings that were designed to communicate civic dignity were also, in many cases, the concealment layer for a surveillance system that had been standardized into the architecture. The same budget line, the same blueprint, the decoration and the observation infrastructure were not in tension. They were the same feature. If you've made it this far, you now know more than 99% of people. The Great Depression is the context most people reach for when they try to explain why this surveillance existed. And the Depression is real context. The banking system had collapsed. Cash moved through the mail because people no longer trusted institutions that held it. Birthday envelopes, remittances, small business payments. In the early 1930s, a sorting worker on federal wages handling hundreds of envelopes a day might process more cash in a single shift than they earned in a month. The temptation was not theoretical, but here is what the buildings actually show. The surveillance system predates the Depression by 4 decades. The stock design, in use in 1909 in Murfreesboro, was developed in the 1890s. The infrastructure was not a response to the economic collapse. It was already there when the collapse arrived and made it necessary in a new way. Someone, somewhere in the Treasury Department's architectural planning apparatus, understood long before 1929 that the conditions for this temptation would eventually exist. They built for it. The operational reality of the system during the Depression years is documented through what inspectors called bait letters, envelopes containing cash, sealed and marked and introduced into the mail stream while the office was under continuous surveillance from above. The procedure was precise. The envelope looked like any other piece of mail. It was addressed to a real recipient. The cash inside was counted and recorded. It went into the stream with everything else, moved through the same hands, sat on the same table. The inspector above watched the table. And the sorter handles the letter. Nothing happens, or something does. In one documented case, an inspector observed a sorter slip a bait letter into an unassigned post office box. A box with no owner, a hiding place inside the building itself. Not taken home, not opened on the floor, tucked into a box with no name on it in a bank of boxes along the lobby wall, where it could sit until the end of the shift. When the sorter returned later to retrieve it, he was arrested. He lost his job and was prosecuted. That is the complete account. The name is not in the record. What is in the record is the architecture that made it possible. The silent external entrance, the catwalk above, the slit in the plaster surround that gave a sightline to the sorting table below. The sorter who hid the letter had no idea anyone was watching. The ceiling looked like a ceiling. The Treasury Department's language for these features never changed. Ventilation gallery, architectural surround, ornamentation. The buildings were classified under historic preservation standards for their civic architecture, their columns, their murals, their classical proportions. More than 2,500 post offices owned by the Postal Service are on or eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. The nominations describe decorative ceilings, period fixtures, integrity of original design. The original design included the catwalks. The nominations do not describe the catwalks. Consider what that gap means in practice. When a building enters the historic register, the nomination document becomes the primary lens through which its significance is understood. Future renovators consult it. Historians reference it. The architectural features it identifies as significant are the ones that get preserved. The ones it doesn't identify are the ones that get repurposed without comment, bricked over, or simply left in place with no record of what they were. The Murfreesboro inspector's entrance was bricked over at some point after the building was vacated. No record exists of when or by whom, or whether anyone decided that was worth documenting. It simply happened. The building's official history describes a civic monument. The east wall describes a different building. This is not a claim that anyone suppressed the documentation deliberately. It is a description of what the documentation contains. The architectural significance of a louvered grille is its decorative contribution to the coffered ceiling. The operational significance of the same grille was a different matter, visible only from the other side. By the 1970s, as the buildings aged and postal operations relocated to newer facilities, the surveillance infrastructure was simply left in place, not sealed, not documented, not removed. In Murfreesboro, when the building was renovated into a performing arts center in the mid-1990s, the theater company discovered that the original renovation plans had omitted a sound and lighting booth. They solved the problem by routing their lighting technicians through the inspector's stairwell, up the external entrance, across the first catwalk, up a ladder to the crossover catwalk, to the center of the attic, down a second ladder. The system that was built to watch workers now positions a technician above an audience. The lighting technician does that climb for every performance, enters through the east door, moves through the attic in the dark, looks down through the same slit that looked down on sorting tables 90 years ago. He almost certainly knows the history of the building. The climb makes it hard to forget. There are post offices from this era in every mid-sized American city. Many have been converted. A film producer bought the Venice, California post office in 2012. The historic Greenwich, Connecticut post office became a furniture showroom. The Nashville post office is now an art museum. The Santa Rosa building is the Museum of Sonoma County. Most of the conversions preserved the decorative ceilings because the decorative ceilings are what the historic preservation frameworks identified as significant. The external doors on the east sides of these buildings, when they haven't been bricked over, open onto staircases that the new owners inherited without documentation of what they were for. The catwalks are still there in some of them. The viewing slits are still there. The architecture of the buildings did not change. What changed is that no one is standing in those corridors anymore. looking down through the plaster at workers who don't know they're being watched. The function ended. The infrastructure remained. This is what the pattern looks like at its full extent. The Treasury Department designed a standardized federal building that carried, in every iteration from the 1890s through at least the New Deal era, a concealed surveillance system built into its architectural ornamentation. That system was operational for decades. It watched workers who were told, if they were told anything, only that they were generally under observation. Never from where, never by whom, never when. The system's existence was not publicized, and its documentation was not preserved in the channels through which these buildings entered the historic record. When the buildings were converted, the infrastructure remained. The label on the blueprint, Ventilation Gallery, is still the label in the nomination documents. The Postal Inspection Service called itself the Silent Service from the beginning. The architecture of the buildings it operated in was designed to make that silence structural, not metaphorical, built in, plastered over, and marked on the approved drawings as something necessary for air circulation. The workers who sorted the mail and the agents who watched them were in the same building every day, sometimes at the same time, separated by 18 inches of plaster and a slit the width of a human eye. What those workers moved through every day, what they breathed under, ate lunch under, sorted thousands of envelopes under, was a civic monument that had been designed with a second purpose its builders never named out loud. The ornamentation remains. The workers are gone. The external entrances, where they haven't been sealed, open onto staircases that go up in the dark and end above the place where people used to stand and handle things that were supposed to be private. The ceiling still looks like a ceiling,